You're listening to Now It's the News. I'm Beowulf Rockland. Matt Taibbi is a reporter for Rolling Stone. He's the author of 4 New York Times bestsellers, The Great Derangement, Griftopia, The Divide, and Insane Clown President, the current occupant of the Oval Office, as well as the recent I Can't Breathe and The Business Secrets of Drug Dealing. His most recent book is Hate Incorporated. It's digitally serialized. You can check it out at Taibbi, that's TAIBBI.substack.com. Matt, welcome to Now It's the News. Thank you so much for being here. Real pleasure.
No, thanks for having me on.
So I got to say, you're one of the few authors that has consistently made me laugh out loud over the years reading your work. I remember, I think
I'm glad.
It's been a real pleasure reading a lot of your work. I remember, I think it was in The Nation back in 2004 when you were covering the Howard Dean campaign. Your descriptions of his just like preparing himself to be interviewed or photographed on the tarmac at somewhere in Iowa or New Hampshire or wherever it was, just made me laugh and have to repeat your wording to the nearest person next to me. Who are your influences in writing? Because it's a pretty rare thing for me these days, especially when you're talking about contemporary political writing. Who do you draw on for your style? Who influenced you as you were developing as a writer?
It's very strange. I grew up very nerdly. When I was in my teens, I was very socially awkward, and my escape was comic novels, and so I ended up reading a lot of books, particularly in translation. So my real heroes were mostly all Russians. They were people like Nikolai Gogol.
Wow.
And Bulgakov. So when I got older, of course, I read Hunter Thompson and H.L. Mencken. I think those are people that I definitely do try to rip off every now and then. But most of the people that I grew up reading were people like Evelyn Waugh, people who were writing funny novels.
That's awesome. Okay, very interesting. Maybe it's just my personal preferences and who I really was into when I was young, but I would have sworn that Tom Wolfe would have been in there somewhere.
I did read Tom Wolfe for sure. In fact, there was a book of his that's kind of obscure that I really loved called From Bauhaus to Our House.
Oh, I love that one. Yeah.
That was about architecture. I also used to see him pretty regularly because my father lived in the West Village and used to hang out at a bar called the Lion's Head. And on my way to see him, I would see Tom Wolfe at that bar. So I didn't talk to him very often, but definitely read his books for sure. Right stuff too.
That's awesome. I was lucky enough before he passed away to have gone to a book signing of his in the San Francisco Bay Area, and advised him as he signed my book not to get Brian De Palma have his hands on the next book that he wrote. I think it was for Man in Full that I was getting signed. But no, that's fantastic, and it's great to hear your breadth of influences. And one of them that you mention in the book, and this is about sort of the confluence, the collusion, if you will, between the media and the government, and you detail it with amazing prose and amazing perception, is a volume that I've certainly heard of, since my time in college, but never got around to reading. And I mean to correct that error. Is Manufacturing Consent. How did that influence you when you read it when you were 19 years old? And how do you think it speaks about the media and political age in which we live?
So I grew up in a family of reporters. I'd been around the press my whole life. My father was a television reporter. Basically everybody I knew from the time I was 4 years old was in the media, and I thought I was a real expert in the press by the time I was probably 12 or 13. And then I read this book when I was in college, Manufacturing Consent, which is by Noam Chomsky and another academic from Wharton called Edward Herman.
Right.
And I'll be upfront. It's a tough book to read. It's not a readable volume, but it's essentially about how the American media avoids certain topics and has a kind of informal propaganda system that even people who are in the business are not aware of. And it rang very true to me at that age, and it was a big influence on my career when I went into journalism, because the book is essentially about how we're trained to look at the world through the viewpoint of the American foreign policy lens, where we do not pay attention to the atrocities of American client states. We do pay attention to things that our enemies do and that sort of thing. So I spent a lot of time on that book and about how media deceptions work.
Yeah, and certainly grab any headline, especially if you're talking about ignoring those that are allies oppress. If you look at the Khashoggi case, it continues. There's point after point, headline after headline, which you can apply those same things to. And the book came out in 1988, and obviously a pre-internet age. How do you think, what they laid out in that book has changed and evolved, and you describe some of the adaptations that they've made and how the landscape has transformed somewhat in your book, Hate Incorporated. How has it shifted, and how does it apply to the age in which we live?
Yeah, so, prior to the mid-'80s or there were two big innovations that kind of hit the media business in the late 80s. One was the 24-hour cable news cycle, which sort of created a new problem for people in the news business, which is we suddenly had oceans and oceans of time we had to fill.
Yeah.
And then the other one was the Internet. And so in the old days, the commercial strategy of the three dominant networks and the few newspaper changes, it was all the same. They were looking for the widest possible audience, so they were looking for a broadly inoffensive tone. That still persists today. Like if you pick up the USA Today, for instance, you're going to find a very dull, flat third-person voice, and that's intentional. That's designed to be inoffensive to as many people as possible. And you'd often have an anchor who would begin a broadcast by saying something like "Good morning, everybody," or "Good evening, everybody." With the new landscape, that changed. The new strategy was let's pin down one demographic and corral it for good, and keep those people coming back and forget everybody else. And that really began with outlets like Fox. I mean, it doesn't matter what you think about their politics. The commercial strategy was really about we're going to target this one particular group of people, and we're going to give them news that appeals to them. And that was replicated by other news networks later on, and we now see that across the spectrum with MSNBC and others. Yep. And that's been a major change in the business.
No, absolutely. We're speaking with Matt Taibbi. His most recent book is Hate Incorporated. He's a reporter and editor with Rolling Stone. You can check out Hate Incorporated on Taibbi, TAIBBI.substack.com. Tell me why you decided to sort of serialize this digitally, take that approach instead of come out with a traditional book. Is that just a reflection of how people read these days?
I thought I'd give it a try. I was approached by somebody last year to try this out by this new company, Substack. It's still going to come out as a book when I'm done. There's going to be a hard copy, but when I was growing up, I had writer heroes of mine who had serialized books, people like Raymond Chandler, and I thought it would be a cool thing to try to see if you could do it on a clock. It turns out it's pretty hard, but it's been fun, and I think it's been interesting because it forces you to stay in a schedule that you otherwise wouldn't, which has been interesting for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's a long tradition if you think about it. I mean, Dickens was doing it in the mid-19th century, and
Vanity Fair.
There you go.
Yep.
it's a reversion in a way to an older format, and it kind of works. I'll definitely look forward to the book coming out as well. You called it Hate Incorporated, and as we mentioned, it sort of talks about the confluence between media and politics. Why Hate Incorporated particularly? In what sense does this vast machinery of media and government produce hate? I mean, how what's the process there, and why did you decide to name it that?
Well, I started to become troubled by a lot of trends in the business, I don't know, maybe about 10 years ago, and they've really only gotten worse. Mm-hmm. I mentioned before the development of the 24-hour news cycle. Yeah. One of the first things that happened is that news companies started looking around and saying, my God, what can we do to fill all this time? Mm-hmm. And the first things that they tried to do were they would look for stories that had like an ongoing visual or breaking angle, like, right. A baby falling down a well or a submarine disaster or whatever it was. Yeah. But then they soon figured out that the easiest way to fill all that time was just to have a panel and to have a point of reference, like a subject where you do a little tiny bit of reporting about a news story of the day and then have a whole bunch of people arguing about it all day long. Yeah. And this became kind of like a formalized part of the news landscape. We essentially trained audiences to view politics as something, as a form of stylized combat, just like sports. Yeah. With shows like Crossfire, you would tune in and you would watch to see if your side won that day. And the key underlying theme of this is that there could never be a resolution. There's never a show where they shake hands at the end and say, you know what, you're right. Let's all get along. It can't work that way. Like financially, it doesn't work that way. So we are financially bound to wind you up as much as possible, and essentially the promise of most news programming is tomorrow's going to be worse than today. Tune in to find out what that is. and it's a horrible thing, but we manipulate people and we get them, geeked up on anger, and the easiest way to do it is just to show them some other group of people that they dislike. Right. And that's very troubling.
It's kind of symptomatic of the economics of the industry, isn't it? Because having a bunch of people in a room shouting at each other is a hell of a lot less expensive than hiring an actual reporter. Reporting is expensive. I mean, to get information, to track down facts is a costly enterprise, and it's value-wise, if you're just looking to sell ads, then having people shouting it's more dramatic. It's less expensive. I mean, from a raw economic perspective, and that is what they look at. There's just no comparison.
Reporting is costly in like three different directions. Number one, there's just the fact that you have to employ the reporter to do a lot of reporting over a long period of time. So, just to take an example, like if you remember the Chiquita Banana expose that the Cincinnati Enquirer did, so you're losing two of your best reporters for 4 months at a time to one story, all right? So they're going to be gone. You're going to be paying them all that money to do that story. Yeah. Then there's the opportunity cost, because while they're doing that story, they're also not doing daily hits and 500-word articles about ribbon cuttings or whatever it is. So you're losing that stuff. And then the third thing is, by the time you're done doing your expose, you've probably cost yourself an advertiser. Like if you're hitting a big company that produces something, any kind of consumer product, that you're never going to see that money again. So the networks pretty quickly figured out that the last thing they want to do is in-depth investigative reporting, particularly about big companies. So why not just have people on set shouting about something that has to do with national politics? You won't cost yourself anything. And as you say, it's visually more dramatic, and it's more addictive also mentally. Like, people don't like to hear bad news. Like, they don't like to digest the hard truth, but they do like to kind of tune in to see people yell at each other.